The world of a medieval Villein was small. It was usually limited to the village where they were born. This village was part of a manor. A manor was a large estate of land controlled by a lord. The lord could be a knight, a baron, or even a monastery. The manor was the center of everything. It had a village, farmland, a church, and the lord's own house, called a manor house or a castle. Most people in England during the Middle Ages lived on a manor like this, and most of those people were villeins. So, what was a villein? A villein was a peasant, but not just any peasant. They were legally tied to the land they worked. They were not free. This is the most important thing to understand about them. They were not slaves, though. A slave was personal property. A lord could buy or sell a slave like a cow or a cart. A villein was different. A villein belonged to the manor. If the manor was sold, the villeins went with it. They were part of the deal, like the fields and the forest. They couldn't be sold individually away from their family and their land. This gave them a small but important degree of security that a slave did not have. To understand a villein, you have to understand the people above and below them. Above the villein was the lord of the manor. He held the land from a greater lord, or the king. In return, he owed military service or money. The lord was the law on his manor. He ran the local court, collected taxes, and demanded labor from his peasants. Below the villein, in some places, you might find a few actual slaves, especially in the earlier medieval period. But this was rare. There were also free peasants. They were called freemen, or sometimes sokemen. A freeman might rent their land from the lord for cash, or they might even own their own small patch of land. They could leave the manor if they wanted. They could marry who they pleased without asking permission. They had more rights in a court of law. A villein looked at a freeman with a kind of envy. The line between them was clear and legally defined. A freeman had rights. A villein had obligations. The word villein itself comes from the Latin word villanus, which just means an inhabitant of a villa, or a country estate. Over time, the word came to mean someone who was unfree. It also became the root for the modern word villain. This shows how the upper classes, the people who wrote the documents, viewed them. To the nobility, villains were a lower class of person, tied to the dirt and lacking honor. But for the villains themselves, their life was not about being evil, it was about survival. It was about work, family, and a constant grinding relationship with the land and the lord. The land on the manor was divided up. Part of it was the lord's personal land, called his demesne. This was the best land, and the produce from it went directly to the lord's table, or to be sold for his profit. The rest of the farmland was for the villagers, but it wasn't divided into neat, square fields like we see today. It was organized into large open fields, and each Villein family was assigned a number of strips in these fields. One family's strips would be scattered across different fields. This was meant to be fair so that everyone got a mix of good and bad soil. The Villein did not own these strips, they held them from the lord. In exchange for the right to farm these strips and live on the manor, the Villein owed the lord. They owed him a great deal. Their entire life was structured around paying this debt. Beyond the fields was the common land. This was woodland for gathering firewood and grazing pigs, and pasture for grazing cows and sheep. Every villager had a right to use the common land, though these rights were often strictly controlled by the lord. The manor was a self-contained world. The food was grown there, the clothes were made there. The justice was decided there, and the villein was the engine that made it all run. They were the base of the entire feudal pyramid. Kings, barons, and knights all lived off the labor of the villein toiling in the field. Without them, the entire system would collapse. Their lives were hard and their status was low, but they were the foundation of medieval society. A villein's life was a cycle of work, dictated by the sun and the seasons. It began at sunrise and ended at sunset. There were no weekends, no paid holidays. The only breaks came from church festivals, which were frequent but short. The work was physical, relentless, and essential for survival. The villein's home was simple and small. It was usually a one-room hut made of a wooden frame with walls of wattle and daub. That was a mixture of woven sticks, mud, straw, and animal dung. The roof was thatched with straw or reeds. There was no floor, just packed earth. A fire burned in a hearth in the center of the room. There was no chimney, so the smoke filled the small space before escaping through a hole in the roof. It was dark, smoky, and crowded. The family, which could include parents, children, and grandparents, all lived and slept in this single room. Often, they shared it with their animals. Bringing a cow or pig inside during the cold winter could be the difference between the animal living or freezing to death. It also provided a little extra warmth for the family. Food was basic and monotonous. The main meal was a thick soup or stew called pottage. It was made from peas, beans, and whatever vegetables were available from the small garden patch next to their hut. They ate it with dark, heavy bread made from rye or barley. Wheat was for the Lord. Meat was a luxury. A Villein family might have a pig, which they would fatten up and slaughter in the autumn. Every part of the pig was used. The meat was salted and smoked to last through the winter. They might also have a few chickens, which provided precious eggs. They drank weak, homemade ale. It was safer than the water, which was often unclean. Ale was a source of calories and a small comfort in a hard life. Starvation was a real and constant threat. A bad harvest can mean a winter of hunger, or worse. The year was divided by agricultural tasks. In the spring, the fields had to be plowed. This was brutal work. The plow was a heavy wooden machine pulled by a team of oxen. It took several men to guide it. The Villein had to provide his own oxen, or team up with his neighbors if he couldn't afford a full team himself. After plowing came sowing the seeds of barley, oats, and wheat. Summer was for weeding the fields by hand and tending to the garden. The most important time of year was the late summer harvest. This was when everyone, men, women, and children, worked in the fields from dawn until dusk. They cut the grain with sickles and scythes. The harvest had to be brought in quickly before the autumn rains ruined it. It was a race against time. A successful harvest meant survival. A Villeins family was a working unit. The man did the heavy field work like plowing and ditching. The woman was responsible for the home, the children, the garden, and the animals. She cooked the pottage, milked the cow, brewed the ale, and spun wool into thread to make clothes. Children started working as soon as they were able. Young children would be sent to scare birds away from the crops or to gather firewood. As they grew older, they would help their parents in the fields. There was little time for childhood as we know it. Life was also filled with dangers. Disease was common. A small cut could become infected and lead to death. There was no understanding of germs. Childbirth was extremely dangerous for both mother and child. Most people did not live past their 40s. Life was fragile, but it was not all misery. The village community was strong. People had to work together to survive. They shared plows and oxen. They helped each other during the harvest. The church was the center of social life. Sunday Mass was a chance to see neighbors and hear news. Church festivals were the main holidays. On days like Easter or Christmas, there would be a feast, games, and drinking. These moments of celebration were precious. They were a brief escape from the daily grind. For a Villein, life was a constant struggle. But it was also a life of family, community, and a deep, practical connection to the land they worked. They knew the soil, the weather, and the seasons in a way that we can hardly imagine today. Their life was hard, but it was a life, not just an existence. A Villein was not free because their life was controlled by the lord of the manor. This control was not abstract. It was a set of very specific rules, payments, and obligations that shaped every aspect of their existence. The core of this relationship was labor. The Villein held land from the lord, and in return he owed the lord work. This work took several forms. The most common was week work. A Villein had to work on the lord's personal land, the demisne, for a set number of days each week. This was usually 2 or 3 days. This was not paid work. It was a form of rent paid in sweat and effort. The Villein had to plow the lord's fields, sow his seeds, and weed his crops before he could attend to his own strips of land. The lord's work always came first. This meant a Villein's own harvest could be at risk if the lord demanded work at a crucial time. Then there was boon work. These were extra days of labor that the lord could demand during the busiest times of the year, like planting and harvesting. During boon work, the lord would often provide food and drink for the workers. It was a way to get a lot of labor concentrated at a critical time. While the food was a small perk, it was still compulsory work. Refusing to show up for boon work would mean punishment in the manorial court. Besides labor, the Villein owed the lord payments in kind. This meant giving the lord a portion of what they produced. They might have to give him a certain number of chickens or eggs each year. They had to give a share of their grain. The lord also controlled the essential equipment on the manor. If a Villein needed to grind his grain into flour, he had to use the lord's mill, and the miller would take a portion of the flour as a fee. If he needed to bake his bread, he had to use the lord's oven for another fee. If he wanted to press his apples into cider, he had to use the lord's press. There was no way to avoid these payments. The lord owned everything. The lord's control extended into the most personal parts of a Villein's life. A Villein could not leave the manor. To do so without the lord's permission was to become a fugitive. If caught, they would be brought back and punished. If a Villein's son wanted to become a priest, the lord had to give his permission, and usually demanded a payment for the loss of a worker. And marriage was also controlled. If a Villein's daughter wanted to marry someone from outside the manor, The Lord had to approve, and he demanded a fee for this. This fee was called merchant. The logic behind merchant was that the Lord was losing a potential worker and her future children, who would also have been his Villeins. There's a clear sign that the Lord saw his Villeins not just as tenants, but as a resource. Even death did not end the obligations. When the head of a Villein family died, his heir could not simply take over the family's land. He had to pay an inheritance tax to the Lord. This was called heriot. The heriot was often the family's best animal, like an ox or a cow. For a family that was already grieving and struggling, losing their best animal could be a devastating blow. It could push them to the edge of survival, but it was the Lord's right. All these rules were enforced in the manorial court. The court was usually held in the manor house. The Lord, or his steward, acted as the judge. The court dealt with all the local issues, disputes between villagers, minor crimes like theft, and most importantly, enforcing the Lord's rights. A villain who failed to perform his labor service or who tried to avoid a payment would be summoned to the court. He would be fined, and the fine was paid to the Lord. For the villain, there was no other justice system. The king's courts were for freemen. The manorial court was the law, and the Lord was the lawgiver. This complete legal and economic control was what it meant to be unfree. The villain was tied to the land and bound to the Lord from the cradle to the grave. The life of a villain might seem like a permanent, unchanging state. For many, it was. They were born a Villein, lived as a Villein, and died a Villein. But the system was not completely sealed. There were ways to escape, paths to freedom. These paths were narrow and difficult, but they existed. And over time, powerful forces began to create cracks in the very foundation of the manorial system. One way to become free was through manumission. This was a formal legal process where a lord granted a villain his freedom. The villain would be given a charter, a piece of paper declaring him a freeman. This was not an act of charity. Freedom almost always had to be purchased. A villain and his family might have to save for years, selling extra produce at a local market to scrape together the large sum of money the Lord demanded. It was rare, but it was possible. Sometimes a lord might free a villain for exceptional service, but money was the most common reason. A more risky path to freedom was to run away. A villain who ran from his manor was a fugitive. If he was caught, he would be punished and returned to his lord. But if he could make it to a chartered town or city and live there for a year and a day without being caught, he would be declared a freeman. The towns had a saying, "Town air makes you free." Towns were outside the direct control of the local lords and were eager for new workers and craftsmen. This was a dangerous gamble. The runaway Villein would arrive in the city with nothing and would have to find work and a place to live while constantly looking over his shoulder. But for some, the chance of freedom was worth the risk. In other words, becoming a priest or a monk meant leaving the world of labor behind. But this was not an easy path. It required an education, which most Villeins did not have, and it also required the Lord's permission. A lord was not eager to let one of his workers go, so a payment was usually necessary. Still, for a bright and determined boy, the church offered a ladder out of the fields. These were individual escapes. They allowed some people to break free, but they did not change the system itself. The event that truly began to break the system was not a plan or a rebellion, but a disease. In 1348, the Black Death arrived in England. It was a terrible plague that swept across the country. It killed a huge portion of the population. Some historians estimate that a third, or even a half, of all people in England died. The Black Death was a human tragedy on an unimaginable scale, but it had a profound and unexpected economic consequence. Suddenly, there was a massive labor shortage. In the world before the plague, there were many workers and not enough land. The lords had all the power. After the plague, everything was turned upside down. There was plenty of land, but very few people to work it. For the first time, the Villein had bargaining power. Lords were desperate for workers to plow their fields and harvest their crops. They started competing for peasants. A lord might try to lure Villeins from a neighboring manor by offering them better conditions. Villeins began to demand changes. They wanted their labor services to be replaced with cash rents. Instead of working 3 days a week on the lord's demesne, they would pay the lord a fixed amount of money per year. This gave them more control over their own time and their own work. They wanted higher wages for any extra work they did. The ruling class was horrified by this shift in power. The king and the great lords tried to stop it. In 1351, they passed the Statute of Laborers. This law tried to freeze wages at the pre-plague levels. It made it illegal for a peasant to demand more money or for a lord to offer it. It also tried to stop peasants from moving around the country in search of better work. But the law was impossible to enforce. The economic reality was too strong. Lords needed workers, and they would quietly break the law to get them. The Black Death did not end villeinage overnight, but it fatally wounded the old system. The old bonds of labor service began to dissolve and be replaced by caste relationships. Villains started to act more like tenants. They began to see themselves not as a permanent unfree class, but as individuals who could negotiate for their labor. The world was changing. The cracks in the system were widening into fractures. The idea of freedom was no longer a distant dream for a lucky few. It was becoming a possibility for many. The changes started by the Black Death continued for the next century. The old way of doing things was breaking down. Lords found it more and more difficult to force their tenants to perform labor services. The peasants resisted. They would work slowly, do a bad job, or simply not show up. It was more efficient for the lord to just rent out his domense land for cash and use the money to hire laborers when he needed them. This new arrangement was better for both sides. The lord got a reliable income without having to manage a workforce. The peasant got control over his own time. He was no longer a serf, but a tenant farmer. This shift created a new class of peasant, the yeoman. A yeoman was a prosperous farmer who held his land on a long-term lease for a fixed cash rent. He might even hire other, poorer peasants to help him. The yeoman was technically a commoner, but he was proud, independent, and often quite wealthy. He was a world away from the poor, dependent Villein of the 13th century, but the old system did not die without a fight. The lords and the government still tried to hold on to their traditional rights. They still tried to collect the old taxes and fees. This created a lot of anger and resentment among the peasantry. They had seen their economic power grow, and they now wanted their legal status to catch up. They wanted an end to the last vestiges of serfdom. This anger boiled over in 1381 in the Peasants' Revolt. The revolt was sparked by a new poll tax, a flat tax on every adult. It was the final straw for a population that was already angry about wage limits and the old feudal obligations. Peasants from all over the southeast of England marched on London. They were led by men like Wat Tyler and John Ball, a preacher who famously asked, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Their message was radical. They wanted an end to villeinage. They wanted all men to be free. They burned court records that listed their old obligations. They captured the Tower of London and executed the Archbishop of Canterbury and the king's treasurer. The young King Richard II met with the rebels and promised to grant their demands. But it was a trick. Once the rebels dispersed, the king and his nobles unleashed a brutal crackdown. The leaders of the revolt were hunted down and executed. The revolt was crushed. In the short term, the peasants' revolt was a failure. But in the long term, it was a sign that the old world was gone. It was no longer possible to treat half the population as unfree property of the manor. The memory of the revolt scared the lords. They became much more cautious about enforcing the old, unpopular rules. The process of commuting labor services to cash rents accelerated. The hated fees like merchant and heriot were gradually abandoned. Over the course of the 15th century, the traditional system of villeinage withered away. The relationship between the person who owned the land and the person who worked the land became an economic one based on rent and wages, not a personal one based on obligation and servitude. The manorial courts lost most of their power. The word Villein itself started to fall out of use, because the social category it described was disappearing. People were now tenants, leaseholders, or wage laborers. They were still poor, and their lives were still hard. But they were, for the most part, legally free. By the time the Tudor dynasty came to power at the end of the 1400s, the classic medieval villain was a figure of the past in England. The legal status of villeinage still technically existed on the law books for another century or so, but in practice, it was gone. The economic and social forces, especially the labor shortage after the Black Death, had done what no rebellion could do. They had made the system obsolete. The slow, grinding work of generations of anonymous peasants who pushed for a slightly better deal, a little more control, a little more freedom, had changed the country forever. The name faded because the world it described had vanished. The fields remained, but the people who worked them were no longer bound to them.